Bob Ferguson comes out and he, off the bat, is acting like the biggest fiscal conservative. Here it is.
You were obviously facing a very significant budget shortfall. And, my approach is been very focused since getting elected on making sure that we are scrubbing our budget in detail to find efficiencies and savings that will help address that budget shortfall. I'm proposing a 6% cut across state agencies. I want to be clear, some agencies will have to take more, some will take a little bit less, but basically the equivalent of 6% is what we're going to have. I think people expect that, when you're facing a budget shortfall. It's no different than a family budget. You've got to make your priorities, you've got to decide what's most important, you've got to cut things you can cut, and that's what we'll be doing as a state.
Wow, I agree. I agree. That sounds like something I would have said. That sounds like something a Republican would say, which he basically ran as a moderate Republican after years of showing that he does not care about fiscal conservatism. So I got a lot of texts and emails from folks saying, what should we make of this? What should we make of this? Well, of course, I have some thoughts on what you should make of this. This segment is brought to you in partnership with our friends over at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Make sure you sign up for their newsletter to be notified of opportunities to do just that. So here's the thing. I am happy that Bob Ferguson is talking about fiscal restraint. I'm happy that he's talking about a 6% cut at a time when they have spent themselves into a budget crisis. I'm happy he's willing to go against some of the things that Governor Inslee proposed on his way out the door. I mean, Governor Inslee wanted a massive increase in spending, despite the fact we're facing this budget deficit. But the thing about Bob Ferguson is Bob Ferguson has always been who he thinks he needs to be in the moment. He has always been a chameleon. He's always been who he thinks he's allowed to be in the moment based on political wins. A few more cuts from this. He was asked by Como News if he thinks there's a way out of the budget crisis without raising taxes.
We heard from the House Speaker and from Senator Peterson that they believe they need to raise taxes in order to fill this hole. Yeah. Do you believe that this budget shortfall, as it has been described, that it can be filled without raising taxes?
We're going to find out. Right. So I start the job in a week. So I'm not there yet. Let's start with that. But again, trying to communicate before even taking the job how I'm going to try and tackle this challenge. And so the focus of the transition team, we've got 13 subcommittees. There's no subcommittee on revenue. That does not exist. My directions were very clear to that fantastic transition team. Don't look at it. It's not a conversation for me.
Yeah, not a conversation for him. He did say, however, that the wealth tax, one of the most controversial taxes that Democrats are banding about, supported by Governor Jay Inslee, I got the sense that it's not something he's really in favor of.
Could you support either the wealth tax or the jumpstart style tax?
Yeah, so again, I'm just not focused on that. I did place in the document that you're going to see here that's literally, I think, being released now. I do have a quote in there, right, a comment on the wealth tax. And the reason I put a comment on that is because it is obviously central to the proposed budget, right? So I just felt that was important to say something about that. And you'll have to find the exact words, but I think I express deep skepticism of the wealth tax.
Yeah. Now, if I didn't know Bob Ferguson, if I hadn't been covering politics for 15 years, if I didn't know his background on taxes and policy, I would watch that press conference and I'd be like, this is great. This is exactly what Washington State needs. I would say that is a moderate Democrat, that is a fiscal conservative, a social liberal, and hopefully he's going to do everything that he says there and he's able to get the legislature on board. The problem is that I have been covering politics for 15 years in Washington State. The problem is that I have covered Bob Ferguson for the entirety of that time. The problem is that I know that when he was on the King County Council, he raised taxes by $1 billion and then bragged on the campaign trail for governor about how he balanced the budget on the King County Council. It's really easy to balance a budget when you raise your revenue by $1 billion by taking more money from the people you serve. The problem is that I have all the knowledge of what he did as Attorney General and how, despite the fact that he campaigned on being very supportive of law enforcement and loving the police and wanting to dedicate more money, he had nothing to say when his party was pushing police defunding. despite the fact that he now is talking about, extremism from the far left anti-Semites blocking roadways and talking about that. He hasn't said anything about far left extremism for years. He didn't say anything about it at all during the summer of 2020. The state's chief law enforcer watching downtown Seattle cop cars on fire. 6 blocks of the largest city in the state taken over by armed left-wing extremists. People being killed there, not by police, by the extremists. He had nothing to say. Why is that? Now, maybe it's not because he hated the police and supported police defunding, or that he didn't see it as left-wing extremism, but because he knew that saying that simple truth at the time was not politically popular. And then as the years went by, police defunding fell out of favor. He started to run for governor. There was this increase in anti-Semitism on the left. And he said, okay, well, now it's a politically popular time for me to take that position, for me to say maybe what I always felt out loud. But here's the problem with that. Even though he's now come to this place, even if this is who he really is, he has a long track record of being exactly who he thinks he needs to be to get ahead. And that's why you can't trust anything he says now. Not to mention, our previous governor ran for his job, promising not to raise new taxes. Of course, he broke that promise in a matter of a year. So we could be in a very different place with Bob Ferguson if the political winds shift ever so slightly. You know, I couldn't help but notice that just a few days before he came out and had this press conference, this is 4 days ago, Cascade PBS put out some polling between them and Elway. And it had polling on how Washingtonians want Olympia to handle this budget crisis. And 66% told Cascade PBS they want to cut programs. Only 25% said they thought raising taxes was the answer. So again, Bob Ferguson knows where political opinion is on this issue. He knows very well. And so he has placed himself in the most politically advantageous position. And he will get no credit from me on that. You know, I really think when you look at Donald Trump's election and what happened with Kamala Harris, who is the most popular Democratic governor in the country right now? What Democratic governor could absolutely win a presidential bid in 2028? Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. Someone who has been very moderate, someone who has been very blunt on issues of extremism, someone who is, as far as Democratic governors are concerned, more of a fiscal conservative, someone who got a lot of attention, was almost a vice presidential pick for Kamala Harris. The rumors were he would have outshined her too much. Or maybe he didn't want to attach himself to her falling star while his star is rising so rapidly. Remember, Bob Ferguson thinks about his next political chess move and what happens after governor. Well, the only place up from there is either United States Senate or the presidency. We already had one governor run for the presidency. So if you don't think Bob Ferguson is already calculating those steps and looking at who's popular across the country, who's had their name, what other Democratic governors have had their name in the conversations about higher office. And if you don't think he's going to model that behavior to put himself in a more politically advantageous position, then you don't know the guy. So I welcome him talking about fiscal conservatism after a lifetime of doing the exact opposite, doubling the size of his office as the Attorney General. I welcome it now, but I don't trust him as far as I could throw him, which he's actually a pretty small guy, so I could probably throw him a little farther than I could throw Jay Inslee. But it's always important with someone with his track record of picking and choosing when he has a backbone, picking and choosing when he wants to be a fiscal conservative, picking and choosing when he wants to support law enforcement. It is going to be critical that every single one of us are skeptical of him every step of the way, and that the media does its job every step of the way, which I also don't have a lot of faith in. That segment was brought to you in partnership with our friends over at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Make sure you sign up for their newsletter. Again, that's future42.org.